Okay. Okay. Thank you, Kim. So we're pleased and honored to have Professor Makgoba today. He's born in South Africa and is an academic and public health advocate. His research on lymphocyte adhesion was groundbreaking. He made history as the first African deputy vice chancellor of the University of the Witwatersrand and also of the research-intensive University of KwaZulu-Natal. He has received many awards, including the National Order of Makgoba Silver. He served as South Africa's first health ombud from 2016 to 2023, and notably, he led the investigation into the Life Esidimeni tragedy, a major human rights violation. His book, Leadership for Transformation Since the Dawn of South Africa's Democracy, An Insider's View, is his second book. He's co-authored 17. Dr. Makgoba, you're welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Makoni and colleagues, and all of you that are on this platform for this discussion. I feel greatly honored, I think, to be asked, I think, to participate on this platform, to share some ideas about the recently book that was published. It's almost a year that the book was published on leadership for transformation since the dawn of democracy and insider's view. I have called this book An Insider's View because I also participated in several leadership positions in South Africa. But more importantly, I participated with the people I write about in the book. I write about Nelson Mandela, I write about Thabo Mbeki, I write about Jacob Zuma, I write about Cyril Ramaphosa, and a whole host of ministers, about 25 of them that I worked with since I returned to South Africa in 1994 August. That's the insider's view, that I was inside viewing how leadership decisions were being made at the highest level of our government during a very important period in South Africa's democracy, a period in which our constitution and the drive for the liberation of South Africa was driven by one word, that of creating a transformed society. So transformation became an important element of what I'm talking about in the book. I think the period that I have looked at stretches for about 29 years, which was the time when I came back into South Africa in 1994 and have been involved in observing, reflecting, critiquing, and writing quite a number of articles on the process of transformation in the country. So the book is a personal story of experiences. I think you can describe it as an odyssey, comprised of observations, reflections, critique over this period of 29 years. As you know, I am a biologist, and in biology, a period of between 25 to 30 years is often regarded as a milestone that defines a generation. So as I was reflecting on this book over 29 years, I realized that we are entering a period of a generation in which I think we can reflect as to what happened to our democracy over this period and try and distill the truth of what happened rather than shade the truth, in order that we can deepen our transformation, we can learn lessons, and we can try and improve ourselves as we are transitioning between generations in terms of this democracy. So that's what the book is about, a reflection of a period of 29 years in South Africa, during which a single individual, which is myself, has been making this observation. During this period, I must have written over maybe 80 articles on transformation as I saw it, either in education, in health, in science and technology, that I had to deal with. Just as a, I would say, a responsible citizen, I was never attracted to writing a book to criticize. I wrote a book to critique. And I think I wrote the book out of passion and the love of my country being successful. That is really the background that I did. However, I had to look at what other people are saying in the country. And maybe I should start this conversation by a quotation from a very prominent South African who made the following observation towards the end of, not this year, but the year before, when he wrote in one of the popular newspapers called City Press. And I wish to quote him as follows. He says, "Today we have a broken country." And he's talking about, this is now towards the end of 2022. The education system is a total mess. The economy is teetering with unemployment rife. The healthcare system is approaching collapse. These are the sine qua non of a failed state. Our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our railways are almost beyond use. Crime is rampant to the point that South Africa is approaching a lawless state such as would be the envy of Mexico and Colombia. Men have declared war on women and children. We must hand it out to the ANC, the African National Congress. It has mastered corruption to the extent that sometimes one wonders who is not corrupt in the African National Congress. We certainly need help. And this was Mr. Peter Wundler, who wrote in City Press. This is really, it summarizes what has happened to South Africa since 1994. A country that started with hope, a country that was punching above its weight, a country that was seen as a beacon of hope by the world, a country that had taken a very serious challenge of creating a non-racial, non-sexist, successful democracy that is prosperous with opportunity for everybody that lived in that country. What had happened since 1994 is being summarized by Mr. Peter Wundler. So in bringing this book together, I relied on the powers of observation, my experience of research investigations, and I told myself one thing I need to have in this book is to be honest, and that I should be truthful as hard as I could be, but I should try and get the truth to be humanized so that it can be digestible, because scientific truth can be quite harsh. And sometimes I can write like a scientist, but quite often I do get people around me, like my eldest daughter, who she's an editor who can often, I think, bring the language to a much more humanized fashion. And my wife, who is an advocate, who obviously assists me in just tempering with the language such that it is digestible to everyday citizens. What I did was, because I was writing about important people, I chose not to interview them because I had worked with them. I knew them, I knew their nuances in life. So I just kept away from them and said, I will write what I think, what I've observed, that which is truthful, and I will see what they do when they get to see the book. It's now almost 12 months. None of the important people in South Africa who I've written about have complained about the book. No one has remarked that the book is untruthful. In fact, the opposite has happened, that this is one of the most truthful and balanced, I think, story that they've had about South Africa. The content of the book really can be summarized in 3 words. It's about maybe about just over 300 pages. It deals with leadership. It deals with the transformation which we are enjoined to by the constitution of the country to transform and create a better country for all of us. And by transformation, it meant everything that we're doing: health, education, transport, infrastructure, behaviors, all manners of what human beings are capable of doing. And of course, it's all anchored around the cabinet or the teams that I think we appointed to lead us during this period. As you know, we have now had about 7, I think, elections, and we have had about 5 presidents of the country, starting with Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, Kgalema Motlanthe, that I never worked with, but he was only there for about 2 years, and then Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now on his 2nd term. I want to start, first of all, in articulating the structure of the book in terms of teams, because it is the teams that we built or that we chose to lead us that are really, I suppose, responsible for our fortunes or misfortunes. I think in order to address this issue of teams, I went through several books and I found a book by Meredith Belbin, a Cambridge Don, who had been studying teams and their success and failures over the years. And he defined the roles of people that are in a team as follows: that each member of a team has a tendency to behave or contribute or interrelate with others in a particular way. Meredith Belbin called this a preference. He then, I think, identified 9 team roles that underlie the success of a team. This, he grouped them into 3. The first group, he called them the social roles. These are people who are resource investigators, and these are people who work for team. These are team workers. And these are people who are coordinators. And then he had a second group that he called the thinking group. And he defined them as the leaders of that as a plant, and the monitor evaluator, and a specialist. Like, for example, the chief finance officer of any company are usually highly specialized people. They're not interested in many things. They just want to know about the money, whether the money is being used properly. And then he had a third group, which he called them the shapers, the implementers, and the complete finishers. These are the action-orientated or task-orientated people. Now, I looked at the South African team or cabinet, and I looked at my own teams where I have worked, whether how did they fare in relation to these profiles? Did I have teams that were composed of these team roles? If I didn't, what happened? What is the cabinet of South Africa over the years? How has it been changing? Has it been changing to become a particular type of cabinet? And analyze that over the period of 29 years. Of course, he then came up with the ideal team that it is often composed of about 5 individuals with multiple, obviously, team roles. And surprisingly, if you look at the history or the history of British politics, you will discover that in 1740 in the UK, the cabinet only composed of about 5 members. If the team is too small or too large, it has the best chance of being a failed team. If you look at the cabinet in South Africa, the cabinet of South Africa at the moment, it contains about 34 members. 34. And in addition to this, it has a layer of people called deputy ministers whose role no South African knows what they are doing, who they account to, what they do, but they just siphon, obviously, their salaries. And the total, I think, administration is made of about 75, 76 people at the moment. Now, if you take a country like Brazil, which has almost like 3 times the population, the cabinet of Brazil is 22. China, which is about 1.4 billion, is 26. India, which is about 1.4, it's got 29. The UK has got 22. Germany has got 16. Japan has got 19. The United States, where you all are, most of you are, has got 15. These are countries that are more complex, with larger populations, economically advanced, and more viable than our own country, but their cabinets have been kept to somewhere around 20s, the early 20s. So what has created such large cabinets in South Africa as we have today? I think it's a question that we have to address, that we are really creating a large cabinet that is complex and wieldy, and it can only be defined as a cabinet of friends who want to eat because they have now arrived as the leaders of a country. Their concerns is not, I think, for the well-being of the population, but for their own selfish well-being. And somehow or another, this has been the feature of the South African democracy and the teams that have led our country. When it comes to leadership, I have approached leadership slightly differently from what I think people understand leadership to be. I believe leadership, just like the truth in life, has got many facets, and there are many forms of truth, and there are many types of leadership. I mean, it's easy to identify Biden or Trump, whatever, whether you like them or not, as leaders because they occupy the political space and they've got people that follow them. However, there are very few people who would believe that Miles Davis, the late Miles Davis, was a leader. Or the famous boxing promoter, what is it called? Don, something Don, is also a leader. So there are many forms of leadership that fall into these categories of either being, social, they have social roles, or they are action orientated, they are called shapers, or they are thinkers. Like, for example, most people would acknowledge that Kwame Nkrumah was a plant or was a thinker as a leader. They would agree that Martin Luther King was a thinking leader. And, they would also agree that someone like Bill Clinton maybe it's a kind of a leader like that. But Trump is a very different kind of leader. He is actually unconventional. He does have his own leadership, I suppose, capabilities, but they are unconventional and sometimes quite naughty, irresponsible, and they don't follow the conventions that we're used to in leadership. And therefore, they tend to pose a threat and become unsustainable and unreliable to society. I think the point I'm trying to make is that there are many forms of leadership in society, and all these people that acquire the roles of leadership have a role to play in society. It is not simply the chiefs in my situation that become leaders, but there are priests, there are school teachers, school principals, inspectors. All these layers form leaderships in society, and they behave and conduct themselves in particular ways where they play the roles that are important in leadership. And I think it's a big issue when you have a society that is undergoing transformation, to recognize that there are these multiple forms of leadership, and they need to be coordinated in one way or another in order to play their meaningful role in society. That's the big second item, I think, in this book. The third one deals with the concept of transformation. Now, anybody who is a biologist knows how to define transformation. Transformation is very fundamental or basic. And I often give an example, maybe as a biologist, that, when you have a tadpole, for those of you that have studied biology, and it becomes a frog, an adult frog, that is transformation. Or when you have a normal cell in your body and it becomes cancerous, that is transformation. But when you have a chameleon that changes color, that is not transformation, it's reformation. So transformation is really fundamental and foundational in changing the shape, the structure, and the DNA of whatever is being changed. So our transformation in South Africa is embedded largely in 3 documents: the Freedom Charter that was signed in 1955, the Constitution that was adopted in 1996, and the National Development Plan, of which I was a member. These are foundational documents that define the transformation that we in South Africa need to undergo. And this transformation involves the economy, the structure of the economy, the education of the country, the health systems of the country. Now, if you look at them over the past 29 years or 30 years now, you will discover that actually very little has taken place that is fundamental in terms of the economy, in terms of education, in terms of the health system of the country. We have just basically arrived into this new dispensation and sat back on our laurels and did not transform anything fundamentally, such that areas such as safety, crime, infrastructure, energy, water, and corruption have deteriorated over this period because really we were not preoccupied with transformation. And I think whether we were tired from the struggle or the liberation struggle and we wanted to take a rest, I think we have rested for too long. And in the process, I think the transformation project in the country has suffered a lot. Now, I really look at the 4 presidents that I worked with, and I define Nelson Mandela as a royal leader because he came from royalty. Of course, he had spent 27 years in prison. He was really the person who set up, I think, the new dispensation in 1994, when the world looked to us as a beacon of a nation that was entering a new era. The world was very proud of us. And I think he brought a number of important changes, like setting up the constitution that is the envy of the world today. He was then followed by an intellectual leader in the name of President Mbeki, who unfortunately became obsessed with something that he should never have been obsessed with. He became obsessed with the causation of HIV/AIDS, and he entered a period of denial in which about 350,000 people lost their lives because they were being denied antiretrovirals, and they died as a result. So this impacted President Mbeki's intellect and his leadership, and it has remained a stain on his legacy. Nevertheless, he was determined, I think, to change the country because he brought ideas such as the African Renaissance, and he was insistent on the role of our identity as Africans in the world and to be proud of that identity, almost in the same vein as the late Steve Biko, who I think was the founder of the Black Consciousness Movement, I think during my time as a student. Then he was followed by Jacob Zuma, whose middle name is Geleshegisa, meaning somebody who bites you when they are laughing. Of course, he does bite people when he's laughing. And I often say, he reminds me of Roberta Flack's song of Killing Me Softly. He kills you softly when he is laughing. However, despite these weaknesses, President Zuma was the one who set up the National Planning Commission of the country to focus on what could be best done. He was the president who reversed the denialism of Mbeki by setting up the world's largest antiretroviral program. And he was also the president who set up, I think, the Commission on Higher Education to see whether free higher education was possible. Then we had President Ramaphosa, who inherited the mess of his predecessors. Now he has to clean up that mess. And I think, to put it mildly, President Ramaphosa is a very nice person, very honest person, but he can't make decisions. He really has a problem in being decisive, being bold and courageous. He believes that he can run the country either through task teams or commissions. Every time there's a problem, a commission must be appointed or a task team must be sought out. He just can't make a decision and say, well, this is nonsense. I'm doing this as a president. He doesn't do that. So I describe him as an avoidant leader. He avoids everything that a president should be dealing with. So, so we are in a country that really sometimes you miss the likes of Margaret Thatcher, who were very decisive. Even if they were wrong, they still made decisions because, in politics and in human development, the assessment of wrong or right is not a very easy one. So, colleagues, that is what the book is about. It's about leadership, it's about transformation, and it's about how we as South Africans, over the past 29 years, have, I think I would say, failed to engage in the biggest project of our country, which is the transformation of society. Now, there have been other ideas, whether we are a failed state or a mafia state. I think I've provided evidence that, in my view, we are a failed state. I often tell people, as a doctor, you are not a little pregnant. You are either pregnant or not. So, as I close my remarks, I wanted to say that earlier on in one of the articles I wrote during my critique of South Africa, I wrote an article where I said, change is never easy. So when I look at the history of my country over the past 29 years, I realize the complexity of the transformation we had to do, the complexity and the differences of the leadership styles that we had to follow. All in all, I think it has led to a situation where I think the country at the moment is not the country that I think it was in 1995 when Mandela took over. We are struggling, and I think the last elections have confirmed that I think the electorate is very unhappy with the leadership, the style of the leadership. That's why we are now in a government of national unity rather than a government that is dominated by a single party. I want to close this by quoting one of my mentors, or one of my, I suppose, yes, one of my role models, Dr. Mampela Rampela, who said that the future we desire is in our hands as citizens to shape. We must liberate ourselves from the dependence on abusive public representatives and officials. In fact, yesterday, he was on the radio again talking about how a single entitled dominant party can mess up a country such as South Africa. That is the story of this book, and I'm prepared and look forward, I think, to engaging everybody and to taking as hard questions as people can think of. I'm a very straight talker. I don't duck questions. I'll answer them straight as long as what you give me, I give you back, and we both can laugh. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss this very important topic that I'm very passionate about. And I'll continue to reflect, I think, on the direction of my own country. Comparing it, sometimes I see the mess that is taking place in the US, and I have to laugh at it, being a developed country, but that's the nature of life. That's how we live. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Professor Makgoba, for brilliant insight into your book. I now give over to Prof. Makoni just to start the conversation for us.
Thank you very much, Prof. What I'm going to try and do is to see how one can combine two aspects of your life: the political analysis you made of the different presidents that you worked with, and your role as a vice chancellor. Assuming, hypothetically, somebody was to say to you, can you set up a university in South Africa that will enable the South African government to transform its citizenship? What would be the key dimensions of that type of university? If you were to use a university as an instrument to try and bring about transformation in South Africa, what would be the characteristics of that university if such an experiment were possible?
Well, I like the fact that you say if that was possible. It is clearly not possible, but nevertheless, it's a theoretical question.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I have been involved in transformation of institutions. And the first thing that I always ask myself, in transforming any institution, what it is that you want to achieve. You must define the vision or the goal or the objectives. Once you have defined the goal, like for example, in South Africa, we have defined that we wanted to create, first of all, we wanted to create a society that was non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, and a successful democracy. But then when you have to then go into the mission and the plan of action, you must focus on those issues that are the main objectives. What we did in South Africa, although we had this very grand vision of a non-racial, race has still become the problem. And we have not yet even defined the instruments of how to tackle it. So that would be my first thing. And if we're going to be, for example, to transform education in South Africa, what are we transforming it from to what?
Yeah.
Okay. Many scholars, I think, in Africa, over the years of the liberation of Africa, have suffered from simply the imitative concept of change, where Black people come in, they are all radical, but they still live according to the Western ideas that they've learned from. We are not like, for example, the Chinese, that when they want to do something, it's got to be done the way it is compatible with Chinese culture. We just, we assume that our culture, obviously, or our cultures are inferior. Therefore, we're always looking to imitate the people who colonized us. And we're never able to transform anything because we don't have anything authentic or original that is ours. Although we know where we come from, we know our history, but we don't use that history and those traditions to say, let's put a stamp on this and we change it to the way we live and the way we behave. So taking something like, for example, education, we're still struggling. I don't know how many strikes have taken place in South Africa since the new dispensation on the fees must fall, the curriculum must be changed, the academia must change, also reflect the people. All these things are happening, but the government has never actually said, here is a program, let's do it and measure it in a particular way. So basically, the question you're asking is, define a goal and devise the instruments to reach that goal and be able to measure the goal so that you are able to go back to the people and say, this is what we set out to do, and this is where we started, and this is where we are, or this is how we are progressing. We don't do that. We just continue to imitate. I mean, when I went to England in 1979, when I arrived at the hospitals in England, I felt I was practicing medicine better than in South Africa because all the books I'd learned were about English people. I didn't struggle. It was like a fish getting into water. But we don't seem to see that. So that would be my answer.
So from your experience, is it possible to Africanize the South African political leadership?
It's possible, and there are many examples.
What would that entail? What would that entail?
Well, look, I mean, we have traditional chiefs in South Africa. They command a lot of respect, and they command certain aspects of our tradition that we value in society. So I think it is how, for example, the traditional leadership it's incorporated into a modern democracy. It should work, but I think the modern South African politicians, I think, are scared to incorporate traditional leadership, and therefore there is, I think, they are hesitant. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
But yeah, there is a hesitation. Just like I think most South Africans realize that I think our education is not being transformed in according to the cultural values that most Black South Africans grow up into. Even our health system is the same. We're all hesitant about the things that make us who we are, that are our identity. We're hesitant about them.
Okay. Let me pose the last question, then I'll hand over to Chanel. Of all the different presidents in South Africa that you have worked with, who was the worst?
I think there are two that are the worst.
There are two that are the worst. Okay.
Yeah, it's Ramaphosa and Zuma. And they work together. That's the funny part.
Okay. Let me hand over to Chanel, because I think a lot of my colleagues would want to come in and ask. Thank you very much. Chanel.
Thanks, Prof. Over to Eric.
Uh,
Thank you very much, Chanel, and thank you, Prof, for this opportunity. I listened to this argument on the politicians and the people within the South African state and the whole educational system struggling to imitate the values of the colonizers. I don't know if I got it well.
No, that's correct.
Okay. Now, what this implies is that they are acting on an agenda they didn't create.
Correct. Playing football by the rules you don't know.
Beautiful. And that equally means then the whole idea of a state, they have no ownership of it.
Correct.
Do they sign bilateral treaties? Do they understand the content of these bilateral treaties? And now, how are we going to initiate transformation on this highway? Now, my other question is this. Within the present dispensation of the state, or what some people would call statehood, would a traditional South African chief succeed as a president of South Africa from the whole ecology of leadership within the perspective of a chief? This is my question.
Well, I think I can answer the second question a little bit better. I think traditional leadership would do better than the current system, because traditional leaders in South Africa still do have values that relate, I think, to the people on the ground. So they are listened to. We still have values that we trust around them. So I suspect that they would succeed, but remember that the traditional leaderships now, they don't live in a vacuum anymore. They live in a world of internet, a world that is on social media. So it is not easy that they would succeed, but I think they would do better, and they would command better respect, and maybe they will inject that which I think the population want. I think the population do want a fundamental change rather than what I call a reform. That's what I think when you look at the history of the liberation of Africa, you see it in every country. You know, the colonizers always leave their fingerprints, and we keep on chasing these fingerprints, not knowing how to handle them. And I think South Africa is going through that kind of phase at the moment. Just remind me of the first question you asked.
Yeah, my first question was whether the people who have already been transformed in the image of the colonizer, summarily, are capable of carrying on transformation, which will reflect our interest. And would that be compatible with the bilateral treaties which they have signed, whose content they don't really master? That is to my judgment. I'm sorry, I might be limited to my judgment.
No, I don't think you are limited, my colleague. You know, let's take, for example, not so long ago, we had a group of African leaders going to Russia. I think they were called by President Putin. And they arrived there. Putin tells them that he wants to support African development. They have had to go to Moscow for him to tell them that. But he even tells them that they now have to consider teaching Russian in their schools. He doesn't say, we in Russia, we want to learn an African language. But we must then accept that we must use the Russians that we learn to understand Russian values, Russian systems of governance, and incorporate those obviously into our governance structures. He never says, I'm going to learn the following from African people. And our leaders go there to go and sign documents. Now, you're asking, do they understand what they're signing? My view is they may understand, but they are so paralyzed and so dependent and so colonized that they can't argue against him. So yes, they do sign bilateral relations. Some of them sign those relations out of convenience. Others sign them because they need money to support their system. It's not for not understanding, but because it is convenient for what they want to achieve and drive these beautiful cars when everybody else, rides a donkey or a horse in the village. They don't care about that. They care about themselves.
And to me, that is what the state is all about. The modern state is all about. It's about causing people to sign documents they don't understand, and
Yes.
they're bounded by these documents. And so the strong man survives at the expense of the weak man. This is my understanding of the state. Now, if I got this well, therefore, we think that the traditional leadership may operate on parallel lanes with the whole idea of the state. And the worry is whether the state would allow this traditional leadership to flourish.
No, they want to control them. They want to become a buffer. Yeah. I don't disagree with that. Yeah.
Thank you so very much. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks, Eric. I have a question from Ashraf. How can the very notion of leadership be transformed if it is recentered in the culture of Ubuntu rather than the individual?
Well, you can only transform something that you feel deeply about. Too often, I think African leaders, or we as Africans, we speak about things that we hardly understand, or the depth of which we understand. I'm going to say something here that may sound very, very, very funny, but it concerns me a lot. When Chinese people make love, what language do you think they speak? And contrast that with African people across the world. What language do we speak when we make love? I mean, these are the most intimate feelings of a human being. You express them in a language that is not your first language. What are you saying about yourself? Can you imagine a Japanese couple making love in English? Or a French couple making love in English? It would be an insult. But Africans, we don't mind. We are so colonized. It's almost like we take it for granted. I'm sorry to use this example, but I thought, love relations express the most intimate feelings of people and their identities. But we use a language we hardly understand.
So we'll have to start decolonizing lovemaking.
Well, that's a very serious transformation to undertake.
Okay. Ashraf, you are welcome to ask follow-up questions.
Thank you so much. My question is that there are in some contexts, actually, leadership is collectively organized. For example, in Sudan, we have what's called the distance for sort of grassroots political social organization, and led by youth. is a collective leadership. So my question is, that's the basic of my question. How can we imagine a different conception of leadership away from the, because the Western conception of leadership is centered in the individual, and charisma and that kind of language. So if we shift, if we situate that notion of leadership within a collective culture, for example, so how that concept would look like. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I mean, all societies have had leadership of some kind or another. I don't think that the Western type of leadership is the only format or the only form of leadership that is acceptable or that can make a society develop any further. I think you have to look at societies across the world, how they organize their leadership structure, depending on their traditions and their values. So I think in my understanding, I think all forms of leadership should be looked at and should be looked at within the context of where they are occurring. As I say, the problem in Africa, my continent, just like yours, is that we have gotten wedded into the colonized structure of leadership. And we're struggling very hard, I think, to master it and to do it better than, I suppose, or to do it as well as it has been done in other parts of the world. So that's my problem. I do believe that all societies have structures of leadership that they should follow. And those structures are often developed because of the circumstances and the environment in which those societies exist or have existed and have been built over centuries of experience and experiments, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If anyone else wants to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand or drop a question in the chat box. Okay, I see Arthur has his hand up. Go ahead, Arthur.
Yeah, there's so much to say. And thank you for your, what shall I call it, your truth telling. I'm looking for a better word because I've never heard anyone speak about what's going on in South Africa with such candor. And maybe there are lots of people who do that, who have your level of knowledge. I simply have not had the privilege to come in contact with them. So thank you for your revelation, I'll call it.
Thank you.
I have many, many things to say, and I'm trying to keep this relatively short. But let me see if I can just take a couple of minutes and put some things on the table. I have a background in politics and economics, and I was going to go into the diplomatic corps before I discovered that I simply could not for several reasons. But after I got an education in politics, economics, and international relations, which was after I left graduate school, I gained, I hope, something of an understanding. But one of the things, it's always interested me, what's called modernization, independence, nation building, economic development. And what I've always done is look at the countries who've done it successfully. Going back to the points that have been made, they all did it with their culture and their language. Their fundamental text, their governing structures are within their cultural traditions to a certain extent and their language. China and Japan are generally the examples we look at as countries that were able to avoid colonization and control from the West. So it's always good to look closely at what happened in those countries. Then we have other real revolutions, Russia, Haiti, and so on and so forth, and then bring them into consideration also and find out what happened. But one of the things that we can do is look at why those countries were successful and then start trying to figure out why other countries have not been so successful. In other words, in maintaining their independence, building and forging a real modern nation state with a political system that works for their people. That's what I'm saying. Very recently, there's been a rash of books about what to do about China. And I just got one, and I hoped it would be revealing. It wasn't. In all of the discussions, it said nothing about how China got since 1949 to where it is now. And unless you look at that and produce clear answers, you don't have anything. You're whistling in the dark. But let me put some things on the table and let them go where they may. One of the things that we find that in the successful cases, China, Japan, these were already nation states. They had already gone through the revolutionary or unification process, and they were nation states when they were confronted by the Western nations. That's one thing. That was not the case in South Africa. So already we have local particulars that we have to deal with some way. Just to make a couple of points, who has the real power in China, in Japan, in South Africa? Who has the real power? That's a question we have to ask. What's going on behind the scenes of the government buildings and institutions and so on and so forth? And critically, who controls the economy and who controls the military? And one of the things that we have seen in Japan since the Meiji Restoration, in China since the revolution in 1949, is that the governing power, however you want to name them, controlled the economy. They controlled the wealth. They controlled the military. The governing structures controlled the whole thing. And that's a fundamental reason why they were able to do what they did in the time span that they did it. So that's a question that we have to ask in the South African case. And
I can answer that now. We don't have that.
Well, I would prefer for a South African to answer that question. And
well, I am a South African. We don't control the power.
Okay. So already there's a fundamental, unavoidable problem. And I'm just saying, what I'm saying basically is that we need to do comparative work.
Correct.
And identify the problems and then figure out what to do about them. Now, I've been thinking about these things for too long, and I've maintained my sanity somehow. I have an idea of what might work, but I'm at least 100 times too old to try to get something started. Should I stop here? I think I will stop here, and then maybe I'll come back later on and send out some other ideas. So thanks for listening.
Okay. No, I entirely agree with you that countries like China and Japan, they were already nation states. And, you know, they come from old civilizations that they respected. I think we have not learned the lessons of respecting our own civilization or our own traditions to the point where we can assert them onto the world. We are so we're so weak, and we seem to take pleasure in just imitating other people. It frustrates one. You ask yourself, I mean, we have a government in South Africa that everybody knows it doesn't control the economy. It doesn't control the military. It is like a shell. It's a government above a shell. Controls very little.
Mm-hmm.
And we expect it to obviously change the country. And I used to make a very funny statement that, you know, the miracle of South African democracy is the fact that the majority has to beg the minority to do anything. That is the democracy of South Africa, that the majority always has to plead with the minority. Can we do the following? It's not a majority democracy on paper, but not in reality. They are in government, but not in power.
And of course, one of the things that we have to keep in mind too is that none of the transformations or revolutions, if you prefer that term, that have been successful were done with what have sometimes been termed bourgeois democracies.
No, yeah. No, it can't be.
Look at that. We've had very different kinds of governing structures in those successful cases. So we ask, is bourgeois democracy that came up with the West, of course, in the last 400 or 500 years, is that really appropriate for a country like South Africa? And then there's a question that's always hanging just outside of view. Can there really be change without a real revolution? And that's something that Fanon spoke to, and a number of other independence leaders and political philosophers. Can there be? Can South Africa get out of this quagmire with its current form of government and without a real revolution? And the times to do fundamental reform was, of course, when Mandela was negotiating with the powers that were, but unfortunately, he did not take, how can we put it, a firmer and more progressive and more informed stance when he was negotiating, although we appreciate very much his contribution. Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, you know, I think maybe there are different approaches to transformation. I think some people believe that in order to transform something, you must do it the way you have said. Maybe there should be a real revolution. Other people believe that maybe you should break down a few bricks in the building and some things will collapse, and then, you know, it becomes a spiral. So there are these different approaches to, and I like to think that Mandela took the latter. You know, he didn't want to break the house. He wanted to break a few bricks and hope that his successors will be able to see the light and continue. But, you know, it's I think it was not a good risk to take. And that's what happened. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. Just on that point, Arthur, I don't know if you're familiar with Tembeka Mugatobi. Professor Makgoba will know him as a scholar. He wrote a book called The Land is Ours.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was the one that said, you know, in order for us to tell this Rainbow Nation story, unfortunately, it had to be reconciliation and not retribution, and for the story to be told in this way.
Yeah.
Could you repeat that? It had to be something and not retribution?
Reconciliation.
Oh, reconciliation.
Yeah.
Yeah. A very good book. Yeah. I saw that Agogo's hand was up. So Agogo, if you have something to contribute, please go ahead. But before you do, if I could just ask maybe one question, Professor Makgoba, on the role of gender-based violence in South Africa. Since you've worked with many presidents in the country, to what extent has it formed part of the agenda of these presidents? How did they conceptualize it? What were their solutions? Yeah, so if you can just reflect a little bit on that.
No, I think President Ramaphosa has made that one of the centerpiece of his new administration. And in fairness, I think he is the first president to do that. And I think it has involved a number of leading female activists and scholars and leaders within the country. So I think there is a program that I believe will yield results very soon. I think it's in collaboration with the judicial systems. I think to identify people, to shame people, to punish them as best as they can. So it is a new program, but it's a new program that has obviously been evolving for some time without being recognized. And now, because it has almost become a pandemic, it has now become, I think, the centerpiece of President Ramaphosa. And I think he will get credit for that because, as I say, he is the first president actually to take this head on and try to do something about it.
Thank you. Agogo?
Thanks, Chanel, and thanks, Prof. Makgoba. I apologize to everyone. I came very late. I still have the old setting. These webinars begin at 4 o'clock. So even though I had all of 3 o'clock, I only joined now. I apologize. And I know I've missed a lot. I just want to ask one or two questions and say something in my mind and ask the colleagues to respond, especially Prof. Makgoba and also Professor Spears. Prof. Spears talked about, he asked the question, can South Africa make it carrying on with the present system of governance? I take it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that that's kind of rhetorical. My sense is that certainly not, but maybe I'm missing something there. And then Prof. Makgoba also said, and that's something we've heard repeatedly, that the current people in power in government are only in government and not in power. And it's a kind of democracy where the minority appeals, the majority serves the minority. Now, I want to ask, which minority is this? How does this minority have the kind of power that it has? And because Prof. Spears also made reference to, had references to Japan, I came in when he was talking, I didn't get the initial part, so I may have missed that, pardon me, but to Japan and China. My understanding, I'll be happy to be corrected here, especially in regard to China, is a people, whether they were nation states prior to the revolution that has brought them where they are or not, but it's the people in control of their own destinies. Is the sense that I have, largely. Are we suggesting that the destinies of the people in South Africa, and I think this applies to many African countries, including my own home country, Nigeria, are the destinies of the people in their own hands? Even if in the case of South Africa, if we take Prof. Makgoba's reference to the minority, is it the minority in South Africa that is in charge of the country? Of course, I'm gesturing to what might be already coming up in people's minds of course, now well talked about again, issues of coloniality and the influence of a certain section of global North power brokers in these countries that we talk about. We just had Bangladesh, where there's strong indications of the global North, especially U.S. hegemony in the removal of the President Hasina, and a lot of references to the desire for the U.S. to have have an army base in the Bay of Bengal, which is close to Bangladesh, somewhere close to Bangladesh, and the current president's refusal as one of the reasons. We also know of Sahel, West Africa. Of course, we all are bombarded every day with what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and the US's iron grip over Ukraine. And again, what's happening in Palestine with Israel. And we know we have the money, we have the power, we have the economy, we have the military that funds what's going on in Israel comes from. Do we have a similar situation in South Africa? I'll stop there.
Well, if I have to answer for those things that are relevant to me, when we talk about the minority in South Africa, we mean the whites. That's the minority. Historically, this minority controls the economy of the country. They have had more than 350 years of advantages through education, through the health system, and through the international networks of their histories of the countries from where they originated. So they are well networked, and as I say, they are a powerful group of people. And they sometimes, even in South Africa, there are debates as to who controls the current government. I mean, we are now in a government of national unity where, for example, the African National Congress got about around 40%, and the Democratic Alliance, which is a party that is reputably championing white interests, only got about 22%. But when you listen to what's going on in the country, you would have thought that the DA or the Democratic Alliance is in charge of the government of the country. That is what is in the popular media. So whether we are in charge of our own destiny as Africans, I'm not sure. But I do worry that we are not. I think that would be my answer to your question, sir.
Thank you, Prof.
And the person who said that people are in power and not are in government and not in power, it was the late Winnie Madikizela Mandela.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much, Prof. Makgoba. Anyone else would like to ask a question?
I have a comment.
Sure.
One of the things that we've noted, again, I'll return to the successful cases, what I'm terming successful cases, is that, and this is, I think, fundamental, what's in the mind. And so often we talk about political structures and economic structures, military structures, but there's something even more fundamental, and that's what's in the mind. I know the most about China And whatever you say, you have to recognize that there was an ideology of independence, of resurgence, of not being controlled by the Western world and Western institutions. Underlying everything was the ideology which was instilled in people in the educational system and also in those who rose to important positions in political and economic institutions. So there was an ideology in Japan. We don't know as much as we know about China in terms of what was going on in terms of ideology within the ruling factors in Japan. But we know there was one. We know enough to know that there was one. And of course, in Haiti, we know enough to know that there was one. There was a countervailing, independent Haitian peoples, Haitian slave, and even the people of color, but I won't get into that, ideology that was contrary to that of the group that was controlling. In other words, the whites, the French, etc. So one of the things it's always interesting to look for is where is the ideology and to what extent is there a core of people who have assimilated, internalized that ideology, which is meant for control. There are small countries who have been able to maintain their independence through guile and through other strategies. For example, Finland. I always think of Finland. Finland has had a hard time over the last 1,000 years or 500 years or whatever you want to call it. But yet, they have their own thinking. They are together, and they have been able to maintain their independence and do what they had to do even when they were absorbed into Russia or Poland or whatever, and come out today with their political, economic, and military independence, even though they are a small country that could easily be overrun by the larger one. So it's not even impossible for small countries to do something. But I want to put that idea of an ideology that is independent, that is indigenous, and that is imbued in a group of people who can be agents of change. Okay, that's it. South Africa is such a fascinating and interesting case because it's a substantial nation state, 60 million people? So it's not like Finland. It's got a little something going on. It's already industrialized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the question comes back to who controls it. In relation to ideology, and this is my last point, Professor Makgoba has stressed this, is the level of co-optation, buying people out, imbuing people with the idea that the goal is using the system to become wealthy and for your family to become wealthy within the system, rather than putting first the future of the people that you are supposedly working for. Co-optation has just run rampant in the United States, which of course is the country that I know best. It's everywhere. And it's very, very sad. And it's the main reason that the civil rights movement in the United States did not continue beyond the 1970s. There's always the little dollar sign that's being waved, and people often, particularly if they do not have an ideological and moral foundation, it's so easy to reach up and grab the dollar and forget about any principles that you may have had before. So that's just something I wanted to put into the conversation.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Prof. Makgoba, in answering that question, perhaps I can link onto it. In order to drive an ideology like this, do you think we need younger leaders? I'm thinking back, if you can reflect perhaps on where you were during Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, and what the students were advocating for. Yes, for socioeconomic revolution to some extent, but also epistemologically and ontologically a change in who our what our knowledges are, and a call for indigenous knowledge systems to be valorized in South African society. So do you think our younger leaders have the capacity to perhaps drive what Arthur is advocating for?
Well, I think in my book, I do identify a group of young leaders. I do devote a chapter to young leaders that I believe, I call them rough diamonds, because I think they need to grow up and understand the world a little bit better, because the world is both simple and complex. So I think the future of any country really lies in the hands of young leaders. I'm a strong believer of that. I think when I was younger, I used to think that I would change the world, but now that I'm older, I realize I failed. But I believe that there are younger people who can do it better than I do, because they've got, I think they've got the means better than I did have. So yes, I believe in younger leaders. I even believe more in young female leaders. For some strange reason or another, I have often asked myself, let me take the current situation that you're going through in the US. If Michelle Obama and Oprah Winfrey had run for the presidency of the US, what do you think would be happening? We've never had a situation in the world where two big leaders that are female have run a country. And we have had a history of male crazy people running the world for centuries. And we just assume that that's the norm. So I do believe that I think the success and survival of any nation or any nation state lies in the hands of its youth. And I think South Africa does have that. We have a lot of potential in that direction. And hopefully they will save us, because some of them do understand these issues of the fees must fall. They understand the transformation of the curriculum. They understand the transformation of the health system. They understand this gender-based violence that is obviously eating all of their colleagues in one direction or another. So yes, I have more hope in the youth than I have hope in people of my generation.
Thank you. Okay, I will take the last two questions and then we will close the formal part of this seminar. Let me first give the floor to Makgoba Molefe.
Thank you, Chanel. I almost thought of withdrawing my question because Prof. Makgoba just quickly said, when I was young, I thought I would change the world. Now that I failed, I realized that I couldn't do it. I just want to ask the question against the backdrop of what Prof. Makgoba initially asked, and I'm sure also Prof himself, when he said when he arrived in England in 1979, he fitted so well, precisely because the universities or the institutions of learning where many of us learn have not had seen that transformation to this day. That transformation in terms, not only in terms of demographics, maybe to some extent in terms of demographics, we can say strides have been made, but in terms of decolonization of the curriculum, the epistemic framework within which our education system is embedded. And I'm asking this, Mokone, I followed your career very well from the early 90s when you arrived at VES until you also became a principal and vice chancellor at UKZN. I followed your career very much, but then I'm going to bring it straight to you, Mokone. What will have been the experiences that to this day, we cannot speak with certainty that strides of transformation have been made? And you mentioned also Mampela Rampela, and I remember very well, she was one of the, at one point, the vice chancellor of UCT in the early days of our democracy. And I'm sure it's a question that I feel I need to ask Mogoni, because you were at the helm, and given your history and the history of Mampela Rampela as well, history of activism, just level with us. Just level with us. What are the what's going on? What is it that we can't get right, Mugodi? Thank you.
Well, I think first of all, you have to, as I said earlier on, you have to decide what it is that you want to change fundamentally. And I'll give you a very simple example. When I was at UKZN, I often used to argue with my colleagues in Senate or the academics that you guys live in a province where 80% of people dream, think their ideas in Zulu. They dance, they make music, they make poetry in Zulu, they make jokes in Zulu. But the majority of you don't understand this language. And you don't seem to care. And you go in to do research, say in Zululand, you always have to go there with a translator because you can't speak the language yourself, but you're doing some form of research, which is the foundation to knowledge generation. How well do you think you do such research? So I took what I would call a dictatorial decision that we're going to introduce Zulu as a module for every member of staff and student at the university. And you can imagine the fight that one had to go through. The media came into it as it normally does, I suppose, to say how authoritarian and how this will be lowering the standards and so forth. I stuck my head to it. Today, UKZN is the only university that offers a module in Zulu for every staff member. And it has become the most popular module to be enrolled for at the university. Now, the idea of that is that it won't change immediately the texture and the depth of knowledge. But then I think it allows for a different kind of conversation within the university and within the academic circles, such that when you are going to dig for knowledge in your research sphere, you then authenticize yourself in the manner in which you do that. But also you begin to appreciate more what the depth of the culture of why somebody creates poetry in Zulu as opposed to reciting the daffodils or Westminster's Bridge. I mean, that's just one small example. There's another example I can quote. You know, there is a type of potato in KZN called madumbe. I don't know if you are aware of it. It's a naturally growing potato type of vegetable. Now, that required somebody who had grown up within the Zulu community to know that it is actually one of the staple foods in KZN. But in the white community of South Africa, it's rubbish. You don't eat that kind of thing. Now that food today, because we had a young man, a young African scientist who was interested in madumbe because he grew up eating them. It's being sold at Woolworths because he was able to take it and bring modern scientific knowledge into it and make it something that can be marketable, something that he can patent and make it a food that is edible and being sold everywhere within KZN, as far as I know, at Woolworths and so forth. So there are little things like this that will impact on the change in knowledge within the academia. Of course, there are other things like maths and science and so forth. There is nothing magic about science and maths. You know, all human beings have been mathematicians and scientists throughout their lives. It's nothing special. But, you know, we have now appropriated it to a certain thing that it is Western and it's not something for Africans and so forth. So these are things that we need to demystify as leaders within the academia. So the challenge, I think, about the few of us who have been in leadership is also ourselves. Sometimes you assume a position of power and you don't realize and exercise the power you have. You surround yourself with the people who are going to diminish your power, and you call them your advisors. So it is also a personality thing. If you are given power, assert the power and make use of it. You rather be fired for having exercised power rather than be kept for delaying the process of change. I hope I've tried to answer some of your concerns.
Thanks, Mugoni.
Okay. Agogo, I see you dropped your hand.
Okay, thanks. Prof. Makgoba, don't let our names deceive you. Mohayobo, my colleague, and I work at the University of Zululand. We know Amadumbi very well, and I eat Amadumbi very well.
Yes, but you know the person who actually made them the common food that you buy in the shops?
No.
He was the professor of agriculture at the University of KwaZulu-Natal.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
A young African from Pietermaritzburg.
Oh, great. I don't know, Chanel, maybe this conversation is going to be for the point I wanted to highlight, might maybe lead us into the after party, I don't know, but maybe Prof. Makgoba, I'm actually building on what he has already said. I really like that condensed idea of power versus being in government. And I'm hoping that we might use it to complexify a bit, critique a bit, what I heard Professor Spears talking about, and the reference to Finland and the reference to ideology. My sense, and I'll be happy to be corrected, is that there has never been, and there doesn't exist any society of humans without an ideology of independence.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Every human society has an ideology of influence. My thinking and my understanding, again, I'll be glad to be corrected, is the exercise of power. Yeah. Even the person who is killed, even the woman who is raped, had or has whether we can ask that woman why she allowed herself to be raped, or we can ask the person who is murdered why they allow themselves to be murdered, I think is the question we must ask ourselves. And I also think we need to more clearly foreground the role of power and global power structures, which I think decolonial scholarship has helped us bring to the fore. And we need not shy away from that because of the kinds of responses we get. I doubt if Finland would be where they are today or Japan would be where they are today if they have not been co-opted into the use, especially the US-dominated global hegemonic system. There are many people who actually think Japan remains a vassal of the US. And if the US loses its position as a global hegemon, as it seems it will be losing, then there would be trouble. Just as the nations same with Israel. It baffles me. I grew up as a child. I just turned 53, but I'm one of those who grew up, who were told of the indomitability of the Israeli army, of the idea of Israel. But here is Israel fighting Gaza, and they have to rely on arms coming from the US on a weekly basis. So I think we need to foreground power. It's what I think. And think of the global power structure if we are to understand what's happening to countries like South Africa, countries in Africa. And see, I think we really need that. Because I don't think there's any human society where the people did not have or do not have an ideology, a psychology, and a burning desire for freedom, a burning desire for independence. Maybe let me stop here, but I'll be happy to hear what the colleagues say if they find this interesting as we carry on. Thank you.
Thanks, Agogo. We won't have an after party today, so Professor Makgoba, if you have perhaps the last few comments just to close the session, that would be great, especially also perhaps reflecting on Agogo's question/comment.
Well, first of all, let me take the opportunity to thank everybody who has participated, I think, in this discussions. I think I have learned a lot than when I came into the platform, and I feel enriched, I think, in my knowledge of the world, because I'm not a politician. I've never read politics. I just comment using a little bit of common sense that I have learned over the years. I think importantly, I have asked myself about us Black people. You know, wherever you go, we are the subject of studies. We are always chasing shadows. And we don't seem to have something of our own in this vast world in which we live. And I'm asking myself, when is that going to happen? When are we going to stamp our authority and become the trendsetters of what's happening in the world? And why is that so? Why is it taking so long? And it's a question that I keep asking myself. When is that going to happen? That when I open my book or open my computer or my cell phone, I find that Black people or African people, whatever you call us, we are the trendsetters. Because there are so many bright African or Black people across the world. But we seem to enjoy being shadows of others. You know, you are good to be a shadow of somebody and you feel happy. You go to your house and tell people, yes, I'm the only one, I'm the first of this. We suffer from this sort of labels. I'm the first, I'm the only, and then if you fail that, you bring gender into it. If you don't succeed in it, you bring disability into it. We just don't seem to see the richness and the wealth in the world where we can actually set trends. And I'm waiting to see that. And it's a challenge for young people like yourselves to do that. But finally, I'm really just grateful to be able to engage with people across the world, from the basement of my house, quietly, and share these ideas with most of you. I do really take transformation very seriously. It's a passion of mine. It's what brought me back to South Africa. I didn't come back to South Africa because I wanted to be a scientist. I had already achieved that in my life. I wanted to do something meaningful that would add value and difference to people. And it has been a long struggle, and also a rewarding struggle. And again, I'm very glad, I think, that Professor Siepe was able to connect us, and that you have been able to pose questions that are quite difficult and not easy to answer. But nevertheless, they are engagements that we need in order to shape and change the world as we go along. I think on that note, I want to say thank you to all of you. And hopefully we will meet in another platform somewhere. My gratitude.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Prof. Makgoba. I think we're the ones that want to thank you for being here and just sharing with us your time. This time is the thing that is precious to all of us. Thank you so much, Prof. I really appreciate your presence here. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
So I'm now going to give over to Kim just to announce next week's session.